this morning's debate about lifelong learning, entitled Learning Anytime, Anywhere. My name is Graham Brown-Martin. I run an organisation from London, although it's a global organisation, called Learning Without Frontiers. In preparing for this debate, I found myself asking what we really meant by lifelong learning, for it seems to be a straightforward term, suggesting that we are all learners, constantly learning throughout our lives from the cradle to the grave. If learning is not a lifelong occupation, then at what point would it start or end? And when did learning ever not be lifelong? I'm reminded of the quote by Helen Keller, who said, "Life is a succession of lessons which must be lived to be understood." However, it was Gloria Steinem who said of learning, "The first problem for all of us, men and women, is not to learn, but to unlearn." Perhaps here Gloria is suggesting that after what we might call formal learning or education through our school and university systems, we must then unlearn as we face the realities and practicalities of life. Often, lifelong learning is used as shorthand to mean adult learning or learning that takes place once one has completed formal education, perhaps in the workplace. And whilst I'm sure that there should be no doubt to include this learning, I'm not confident that the term should be limited in this way. And the title of the debate is indeed a clue for what we are talking about here. That is, learning that takes place at any time or any point in one's life and at any location. So this then suggests learning that is not only taking place throughout one's life, but beyond our formal learning institutions and wherever one may be, which suggests a variety of medium, from print to broadcast to personal device. It also suggests a blended approach to learning between these various media and locations, and also perhaps a rethinking of skills that are required in order to learn. We must also consider how we mix what the interface is between independent, self-directed learning and formal classroom-based learning. Naturally, with many things that appear straightforward, we discover that the seemingly innocent term of lifelong learning is more complex when we consider the formats of this learning, the provision of this learning, and the reasons or motivations behind this learning. As we move through life, are we seeking new skills? Are well-intentioned agencies and NGOs providing learning opportunities for specific purposes beyond simple reskilling? Is it purely about work? Is it cultural integration or assimilation? Are there other concerns that we should be aware of within the context of lifelong learning? So to help me and help us, in this debate, I'm pleased to introduce our panel of experts who know far more about this subject than I do, who will each spend a few minutes, first of all, describing themselves, their background, relevant interests, and the context in which they're here, so that you can get an idea of where they're coming from. And the next stage after that, I was asked a few questions to get the conversation and the debate going. But what's, in a sense, more important is that we then get your participation, because I'm aware that for the past couple of days, there's been an awful lot of sitting in the audience and hearing things. I really want to have like almost try and get together around a table, as it were, to have a conversation with all of us, because I'm sure all of you have a lot to contribute to this discussion. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. François Taddet from the Centre of Research and Interdisciplinary of Descartes University Paris. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. François, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Graham. I think, I'll define myself as a learner that likes to learn anywhere, anytime. And, I've been learning enormously here in the last days, but I've been learning enormously from learners. The learners that are here, and they're going to have a very nice session around 1 just below the spider, so you're welcome to join them. But I've been learning all my life, actually, from younger people. And I think that I've learned more from the younger ones than from, my formal teachers. And what I've learned is that today you can indeed learn many more things, and very differently. Okay? Because, the previous generations have been learning in one style, and the new generation is learning in a completely different style that they are constantly reinventing. And that's really what I've learned, and especially when I've met the young learners here. Okay? And I'll talk more later about, what we do really in Paris, but it's really exactly the same thing, is helping learners design their own projects and co-construct knowledge individually and collectively. And that's really what we are after.
And our next panelist is Dr. Rosa Maria Torres, former Minister of Education and Culture in Ecuador, and now Principal of Institute Phronesis. Rosa, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, just to kick us off. You need the microphone.
Okay. Well, I come from the Latin American context, which is a very different context, culturally, politically, socially, than the contexts many of you might be familiar with. I work globally for many years, but I concentrate on Latin America, my region. And for the past 15 years, I have been doing both research and action in the field of lifelong learning. I'm a firm believer that lifelong learning is or could be a paradigm shift, not just a buzzword. And I do believe that this concept should be adopted by countries in the South, so-called developing countries, in order to really reshape, redesign, rethink education and learning. I very often use the term learning, and I feel I'm abandoning sort of the term education because of the implications that this have. When you speak about education, people tend to think of schooling, teachers, tests, etc. When you speak of learning, the picture gets a bit broader. So less and less I speak of education, more and more I'm speaking of learning.
And on our final panelist, last but no means least, Dr. Ruth Wallace, who leads the Centre for Social Partnerships in Lifelong Learning at Charles Darwin University in Australia's Northern Territory.
Thank you. I'm from the Northern Territory, which is in Northern Australia. That area has a very high population of Indigenous people, and most of my work is done around education for regional and remote areas. And the first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present and future, that I work with, and their vision for education that has been consistent over millennia, and our discussions about what that means and how we will bring learning into a perspective that incorporates different knowledge systems, different knowledge management systems, and different ways of representing knowledge. And I hope that their words are heard through my discussion today.
Help me out here, guys, because I've been having trouble with this, actually, since I was given the task of chairing this debate, and also reading awful lots of your own personal writings, which I do recommend you Google these guys and find this stuff. But the problem I'm having is with the definition of lifelong learning. I mean, you know, there's so many different kinds of definitions banding around depending on which international aid agency you are or whatever, or where you're coming from. And you touched on it slightly there, Rosa, but I wonder whether you could, all three of you, and I don't mind who goes first, could give a stab at really defining what you believe is how you define lifelong learning. The baton has been passed to you, Ruth, Rosa.
All right. I give great importance to concepts because conceptualizing means the possibility of better understanding and better communicating. Lifelong learning should not be such a trouble understanding what it means because the very term says it. It's learning throughout life. However, and this is very funny, our ideologies about education are so strong and so heavily school-centered that even when you mention the word lifelong learning, people think of schools, and people think of schooling, or people think of adult education today. There's a big confusion today. Lifelong learning, many people associate only to adults. And the term is lifelong. That means from 0 to whatever, 100, 120, whatever. We are learners all the time. So the term lifelong learning in the first place is just the acknowledgement of a fact of life, which is we are learners from the minute we're born to the minute we die. Now, translating this into policies, plans, programs, that's something else. And so that's a challenge. But the concept as such should not bring too many problems if we would get rid of our school-centered ideology of education and this old idea that lifelong learning is about adults.
Very good. Would Ruth or Francois like to add there a bit?
The concept of lifelong learning means that we can actually recognise where knowledge resides, and that knowledge has strong traditions and authorities that manage how knowledge is engaged with and shared and learnt. And that's not always understood by an education system. A lot of it happens out in life, and that means that we also can't get away with, which a thing that's often said in Australia is, let's give up on the adults, they're lost. We will give education to the young people. Where real learning, lifelong learning, is about having the whole of a community, the whole of a family, all those generations learning together and learning from each other. So the best learning is happening when we have a relationship between young people and older people working together. I think that the other thing about lifelong learning is it means that we must understand why people learn and how people learn. It's not just about what people learn. And if we start to think about the why and the how, we need to recognise how learning is negotiated for that person across their whole life. And that what is understood as important by an education system, or what's the return on investment for a government who's investing in education, may not be the most important thing for that person. What's the most important thing for that person is understanding their culture and their tradition. It's being able to engage with their workplace and people know, I really know this stuff, I know how it works and I can do it well. So those decisions about what's important in learning are in life. They're in all of those places, and that actually can drive behaviour and why we engage in learning. And that's something I think that's not recognised in education systems, and it's very useful to broaden the term with lifelong learning.
So we're getting a real distinction here from both of you about the separation from education, sort of the formal learning perhaps, and actually this other thing which is going on outside. Francois?
So I would like to talk about the connection between the two, actually. Okay, because we could have had we've been, since humanity existed, learning throughout our lives. Okay, so what's new today? Okay, what's new? You highlighted some of the debate, but quite clearly we are living in a very interesting moment of history where information is not limited anymore. Okay, so it used to be that the access to information was limited, and so you could learn only by yourself, experimenting with nature somewhere, that's what our ancestors did. And then we organized a mean of transferring knowledge from one generation to another, and we ultimately called it education. But what's important is, how do we learn something within the education system that will allow us to be better learners throughout our lives? You have to learn how to learn, and you have to learn how to unlearn, okay? And you have to learn how to survive in an ocean of information. There used to be, only a few drops of information, and we're thirsty for it, okay? But today we are flooded with information, and we have to do something very different. We have suddenly to be able to know what to drink, what information to seek, and what to make out of the information that we can find. Okay, we have to be critical about the information that is being pushed to us by all sorts of media, including the internet, but also television and radio and books and so on. Okay, we have to have a critical thinking ability and a synthetic ability that will allow us to be proficient lifelong learner. Okay, because what you have to know is that, for instance, if I take science, the numbers of scientific papers is multiplied by 100 every 100 years. Meaning 1 million-fold in 300 years, okay? Meaning, this is exponential growth of knowledge. Meaning that lots of what we have learned is already obsolete, and a lot of what we will learn tomorrow will be obsolete the day after tomorrow, okay? So we have to be able to perpetually reinvent the knowledge that is in our brain by adapting it to the flux that we are getting, okay? That's what lifelong learning is about. And how do you make sure that at a given moment, you have the best possible information at your disposal?
This seems I'm seeing a common theme emerging, and I'm sorry to push this point further, but it has been troubling me. It seems that various international institutions, such as the World Bank, UNESCO, OECD, and the European Commission, as examples, they all have their own take on lifelong learning, and they're not all the same. Where the World Bank, for example, insists in its manifesto that lifelong learning is essential for individuals to keep pace with the constantly changing global job market and technology. UNESCO, on the other hand, seems to have a more humanistic vision for lifelong learning beyond the sort of stark economic imperatives presented by the World Bank and OECD, whereas the European Commission seems to have adopted a direction driven by change in society and by transition to a knowledge-based economy and demographic pressures resulting from an aging population. I mean, what's going on, do you think, with the international agencies like the ones I've mentioned here? Why is there this confusion amongst them? Is it about economic determination? Is it about an aging population? Where do you sit on the World Bank, OECD, UNESCO, European Commission? Who would like to have a go at that?
Well, you're right about what you said before. There are differences between international agencies, but there are also commonalities. Most of them, in fact, think of lifelong learning as an economic development strategy. And the lifelong learning paradigm that has come to us in the South is that kind of approach. It's an economic development kind of approach to lifelong learning. UNESCO, regardless of what discourse or rhetoric might say, is very much still focused on lifelong learning as equivalent to adults. And the World Bank is doing both, also focused on adults. It's very hard to see lifelong learning applied to early childhood. People don't see early childhood as being part of lifelong learning. And the early childhood communities, in part responsible for this, they're not seeing themselves as part of this lifelong learning paradigm. But beyond definitions, which you may find, I always want to look at what is being done, because from there you can picture what is the real definition. And let me just mention the recent evaluation of the lifelong learning program that was devised by the European Commission. They had set in the year 2000 5 goals to be met by the year 2010. And I encourage you to read that evaluation. It's not a big document. It's very simplistic, in fact. And what are those 5 goals? They're all related to formal education. Much talk about informal learning and all that, but those 5 goals, in order to be measurable, which is what people want, goals that are measurable, are all related to formal education. And the sad thing is that the goals were not met by the year 2010. So for people like myself, that when this initiative by the European Commission was launched in the year 2000, I was enthusiastic and hopeful. I'm not longer that enthusiastic and hopeful, because the European countries, which are supposed to be developed countries, have not met those goals. So it's not only a problem of developing countries that we set goals that we never meet. In the North, you don't meet them either. And lifelong learning has become a very flat thing in real terms. Formal education, it's how many children enrolled, how many young people completed secondary education. So it's a very narrow, in my view, understanding of lifelong learning. We want to go beyond that. And I think, as the other panelists have said, the concept of lifelong learning is a challenge for all of us, because it implies going beyond schooling, going beyond the school-centered mentality, acknowledging that there are other learning systems, home, media, internet today, of course. The workplace is a wonderful learning system. When we don't give our youth opportunities to work, we are making a big damage to them, because it's not only that they will not have an income, it's that we are not giving them a very important opportunity to learn, because work is a highly important learning system, and so is the family, etc., etc. So we want to lifelong learning. I'm concluding here, is a challenge for all of us to think beyond schooling. Schooling is there and is important and will continue to be important, of course, but it's not that all there is. And not all, as you know, not all teaching produces learning, and that's the major failure of our school systems.
Okay. Just taking taking it a little bit further, I think we got the picture about the difference between education and schooling and this other thing, lifelong learning. But what I'm curious about is, particularly in the context of a summit like this, is what is the cultural context? Is there a cultural context to lifelong learning? And I know that Ruth and also Rosa, and you've looked at sort of knowledge-based aid to communities from a perspective of the impact, of both positive and negative. I wonder whether you could expand on that, Ruth, when you've been reaching the indigenous populations and the impact on culture. What are you exporting, or what has been exported? What are the cultural issues that we must be aware of when we're putting lifelong learning into other communities?
What we've found to be very important in the work that we've done is that to recognise, we're doing a lot of work in adult education in remote communities, and to understand what work might be in those communities might mean actually saying, what is work and how does it function here? Is it going to be exactly the same as this job is operated as a health worker or a teacher? Is that exactly the same as it might be done in a major city? Or is it actually going to function differently here because that person has a cultural as well as a social responsibility to this community? Often people who are senior people in work and in learning also have very high cultural responsibilities and for how their knowledge is managed. So for us, it's been about thinking about getting beyond a very thin view of what education is for that workplace. So how do I do my job and what skills do I need to do my job? In this place, I don't just need to know how to be a good teacher and how learning functions and how schools function, but I also need to know how do the cultural elements impact on the way that we might do that work? How do we bring culture into the curriculum? How do we work with cultural events that are going on in the community? So rather than seeing cultural knowledge as a deficit, it's actually an integral part of learning. And we've found that multimedia has been really important for that because we can actually represent knowledge in different ways. It doesn't have to be represented on a white piece of paper in a linear fashion that goes down the page. We can actually represent knowledge through layers. We can have shape and colour. We can have a space to negotiate knowledge when you're working across many languages, and we usually are. English is often the people's fifth or sixth language. So if you want to negotiate different ways of talking about culture and how that works within a workforce or how then it works back with the school, having things like iPads and multimedia means we can say, no, I don't mean that, I mean like this. You don't have to have all the words to describe it. And it means that we can organise knowledge in different ways. A strong example has been in the science work that we've done for environmental work for land management, which is a huge opportunity for Aboriginal people in community, because that's a cultural work as well as economic work. And it also then fits back into the curriculum. What's an Aboriginal view of science and what's a Western view of science? How do we bring those together and negotiate that so students learn both? And who should be the authority in that space? Being able to use multimedia means we can represent that knowledge in a whole lot of different ways and have a space to talk about it. It's one thing to say, yes, there are two ways of knowing this. The real hard work is to get in the guts of it and negotiate it and to co-produce, as Francois has already said, new forms of understanding that knowledge. And for us, the key thing then is we understand the how of learning, the how of negotiating that knowledge, the how that knowledge is authorised, who is meant to speak on it and why, and how do we live in a world that brings together those two different cultures.
Do you think that we've seen in some very well-intentioned programs, I mean, I've talked about the big international agencies and NGOs and so on, but I mean, is there a danger that we're sort of seeing a sort of educational colonialism emerging? Is it a fair point? Ruth or Rosa or Francois? Rosa.
Educational colonialism has been there for ages, continues to be there, and I think the expansion of ICTs is contributing to strengthen something which I call the banking education model. Paulo Freire, we're proud of being Latin Americans, among others, because of Paulo Freire. He's for us a reference, an important reference. Transformative educator. He wanted to do education in order to change society. And, well, Paulo Freire was very critical of something he called the banking education model, which is the teacher knows everything and the learners know nothing. So it's a matter of just depositing a check like you do in a bank. Well, this kind of model has been criticized for being the typical classroom education model in schools. What we see today is the globalization of this kind of model. Now we have global teachers, and the rest of mankind, we are all passive learners. We consume what others produce. And again, I think in terms of the North-South relationship, which can be very asymmetrical. Cooperation is seen as a North-South unidirectional kind of thing. It's never seen as a South-North kind of thing. I'm here as a speaker, and I think as myself, many of us have many things to learn, to teach to the North and to share with the North. However, the cooperation model has always been North-South. The knowledge is in the North and the non-knowledge is in the South. Well, we were very critical of that kind of thing, and that reproduces this banking model at a global scale. It's also banking because it comes from the banks, and the major actor behind this banking education model is in fact the World Bank. The World Bank decided that it's a knowledge bank. Banks are supposed to give loans and try to recover them. But this is a bank that decided to be a knowledge bank. And they decided that they already have all the knowledge that we need in order for us to make sure we develop. So there's the knowledge already, it's already there, it's packed. And all we have to do in the South, developing, so-called developing countries, many of us are not developing at all, or are not even using the term, we are supposed to be trained and informed. That's all, that's our role. It's not even producing knowledge. When it comes to developing countries, the word that the World Bank uses is wisdom. It's local wisdom. That's what we have. That's what we are acknowledged. It's local wisdom. They have the real knowledge, the global one. Well, we question that kind of model, and I think lifelong learning is also a way of saying no to that kind of banking model.
I think the banking model is completely flawed, and I'll give a completely different perspective on this, because we completely agree. If I give you money, then I don't have it. But if I give you knowledge, then I still have it. You know, that's an obvious difference that makes the two systems completely different. Okay, and then you can produce knowledge. Okay, unless you are a state, you cannot produce money, and even in the EU, we cannot produce money anymore. Okay, so knowledge is very different from money. So the banking assumption doesn't make sense. Okay, that's as simple as this. Okay, so what's interesting is that in fact there is fantastic innovations happening throughout the world, in India, in Africa, in Latin America. I'll just give two examples that Rosa must know. For instance, Vicky Kolber has invented a model where the children are co-constructors of knowledge that are locally relevant, and they are using some of the global knowledge that is accessible, like mathematics and reading and writing, and are being empowered by this knowledge to create new knowledge and to act upon their communities. Okay, so that's a very different model. Okay, Rodrigo Baggio in Brazil, as is one of both of them are awardees of WISE, has created. He went to the favelas and he's empowered the people with the technologies, allowing them to learn relevant skills that allow them to get jobs and to help their families and their community to be empowered and to act upon their environment. Okay, that's what knowledge is about. It's something that is useful. Okay, I can give you another example. T.S. Eliot, okay, wrote something beautiful when he was saying, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Today you could add, where is the information we've lost in the data? Okay, and we are flooded by data and flooded by information, and it's very hard for us to make any sense and gain any knowledge given all this flux, and much less wisdom. Okay, we have to reinvent things. I mean, the education should be about creating. How do you go from data to information? How do you go from information to knowledge? And how can you try to go from knowledge to wisdom? And can we have an emerging wisdom thanks to this process? I'll just give you an example, because I'm a French citizen, and France has a fantastic technology that many of you probably envy. Okay, there was Chernobyl a few years ago, and there was a radioactive cloud that come all over Europe, but the French technology blocked it over the frontier. Also, the French state declared. Okay, so that's the sort of fantastic technology we have in France. We can, block nature and tell it what to do. And a few months ago we had the drama in Fukushima, and again we had a big cloud. Okay, what should we think about this? Okay, so I'll tell you about people learning anywhere, anytime about relevant things for them. Okay, so some Japanese citizens have built themselves Geiger counter. Okay, thanks to technologies that were spreading through the web. Okay, and they were measuring the data, whether it was radioactive or not, whether it was safe or not to give to their children. So they had this data, but then they wanted the information. Is this data above the threshold of what's safe or not? And then, they could compare this, and then they had the knowledge about what they should give to it or not. Okay? And then the wisdom comes about, let's debate whether we want nuclear energy or other forms of energy. Okay? And that's where, you can rebuild things. But you have to empower people so that they understand how to produce data, what this data means in terms of information, what is relevant knowledge that they can take from this, and what's the collective wisdom that can emerge.
So I'm kind of curious about some of the work that I've read that you've been doing, and I think it would be good to share that about your work around learning science and how you're proposing more experiential and learning by doing approach with your sort of student outreach programs that have allowed those in disadvantaged areas to access the excitement of scientific research. Can you tell us more about those approaches, the sort of crowdsourcing approach to research and so on, to get those people more engaged? Because I think that's sort of connected with what you've just been describing there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm one of the lucky person that was allowed to do research. Okay, but research is traditionally viewed as an ivory tower. Okay, so there is only a small elite that is in this ivory tower, building science and technology for the rest of the people. Okay, so I think this is an obsolete model. Okay, we have today to have a very different model, and you have to allow learning through research to be accessible to many, many more people, because everyone on this planet can contribute to create knowledge that is scientifically relevant. So I'll give you an example. I mean, just now there is a session on learning by playing, and Zoran Popovic has invented a game, okay, where a scientific problem that scientists could not solve in 15 years has been solved in 15 days by gamers, okay, from all over the planet. 250,000 gamers use their collective intelligence to make a difference. Okay? And so what we're trying to do now is invent more such games, okay, that could cover all sorts of areas. Zoran was working with HIV problems, okay? So, this is a serious problem, but there is many other serious problems on the planet, and you want to use the collective intelligence of as many people as possible to do things. Most of you must have a cell phone in your pocket. Do you know that in this cell phone, there is more computing power than the NASA used to go to the moon? Do you know that there is more sensors in this cell phone that most scientists have been able to use for most of scientific history? Do you know that for a few euros, you could transform that cell phone into a microscope, or into something that can measure pollution, or into something that can measure radioactivity? And so not only you can measure things, but you can also analyze it, because it's a computer. And then you can transfer this data and this analysis to a database and share this with other people that think these informations are relevant. And then collectively you can be building knowledge. Okay? So this is what's happening, where people are not only learning, they are also contributing to their own knowledge while contributing to the global knowledge simultaneously. Okay? And this is happening, and it's happening very, very fast. And basically we would like to speed it up. Okay, and make it available to any children, anywhere, any adult, anywhere. I give you an example that is close to Ruth, and then she can bounce back on this. I've got some friends that in Congo they work with pygmies. Okay, they are some of them know beautiful things about their forest, and they love their forest, but their forest is under attack. And these guys not necessarily have been to school, yet they are currently using cell phones to generate data about their forest and the attack on their forest, so that together they can map the problems of their forest and together create solutions. Okay? That's the sort of things that is happening today.
Do you want to come back on that? Because I think there's a resonance there with what you were talking about with your experiences.
I think what's really important about that is we stop seeing learners as passively waiting for the perfect education system to turn up. That lifelong learning is about people getting control of the learning that's happening in their communities. And things like this example are a perfect example of how people are saying, hang on, we can do something about this and we don't need to wait for you. We have that technology already. And what we found about that is very important is that it's about the here and the now. It's not that I'm remote and I live in a place that's exotic and away from everything. Those people in the Congo, that's the centre of the world for them. That's the most important place, and that's the place to take care of. And that's the place to then have a relationship with how learning is conducted. So being able to use the devices for your own purpose, what is that learning for? And being able to have a real world application for that knowledge, that's actually the centre of the knowledge. The challenge, I think, is we're now trying to colonise the education system and saying, hang on, we've got really good ways of learning here. And people are engaged, people want to do it, people want to do it for hours longer than they'll want to be doing homework, for example. And this has real relevance for people's lives, and it has a relevance to their future for really strong economic outcomes, for real actual jobs that are in the future, for environmental outcomes, as well as for social and cultural outcomes. And I think the challenge is there for the education system to say, how do we integrate this back? We've done a lot of work in that area, and what we find is easy is working on a one-to-one basis. People want to, in government, in industry and in schools, want to have people involved and integrate it. What we find is very hard is at the auditing level or the accreditation level, which tries to get rid of a lot of the diversity. And that's where there's a lot of fear to take the risk to engage in these sorts of different ways of working.
Thank you. We have a question that's come in on Twitter, and after I've asked this question, we're going to go out to you guys and really want you to get involved in the conversation here. The question that's come in, I think, is quite interesting, sort of linked to what you're saying, is what do you think, and this is open to the panel, what do you think are the innovative applications of this discussion that we're having here within a context such as sub-Saharan Africa, where most children do not go to secondary school? What does lifelong learning mean for them? Would like to pick up on that.
Well, let's talk about access. Yesterday I was in a panel which I was very happy to be in, because people were very critical of this continued emphasis on access. Access to school, access to the computer, access to... We get happy when we talk about access, and governments get happy, and UNESCO gets happy with statistics that tell us about access. Well, access can mean very little unless there's quality involved. I disagree with politicians and technocrats who have been saying for ages in my region very clearly that quality is something that comes next. First it's access, because you need to the school or the computer now, and then the quality will come. I disagree with that. Either you provide the right to education is not the right to go to school. Today it's the right to learn throughout life. And if it's the right to go to school, it's the right to go to a good school. So these statistics of how many children don't go to school and how many don't complete primary education or secondary education, I tend to give them less value than many other people do. To me, what is important is, do they learn? What do they learn? And is what they learn, is it useful? That's what matters. We don't know. In our statistics, in our grandiose global, national, regional reports, we never know about that. And today, if we know something about learning, is called learning achievement. It's through tests. That's all we know about what our children don't know, because these tests are telling us what they don't know. I wish we could develop another kind of measurement, if it's necessary at all, where we know what do they know? What are they able of doing? I don't know what children in my country, in Ecuador, are able to do. However, I see children every day and I see they do wonderful things. They take care of their siblings, they know how to cook, they cross the streets without the assistance of an adult. They are able to go and purchase things on the shop nearby. And these are 4 or 5-year-old kids. kids that probably will never go to school, but they know a lot of things that if the PISA test would be done according to these skills, which are survival skills, family skills, I wonder who would do best. Would our children in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, would do much better probably than Finnish and Danish children. So I always reject this idea that there are 21st century skills for everyone, that they are universal. I feel like adding a lot to that usual list because survival is already a skill in today's world. And it's more and more so because we have the so-called natural disasters, which have a very important social component. So that much about learning.
Well, Francois, did you want to dig in there before we open it up to the audience for a few minutes?
So, I mean, you ask what are the implications for Sub-Saharan Africa? Okay, I'll just give a couple examples. One that is already there, and another one that I hope will be there soon. Both come from India. Okay. Interestingly, so I think you talked about south-north and north-south. I think south-south is very important. And so in India, there is a guy that wanted to bring education to the rural villages in places where there is no school. Okay, and they were. So he says, now we have cell phones, and cell phones are being used by people that are illiterate. So talking about lifelong learning, and he wanted to help these people have relevant knowledge for their lives. Okay, and so one of the main problems that he was trying to tackle, and that all India is trying to tackle, and all of Africa, is HIV infection. Okay, so the best treatment is not treatment; it's prevention. So he decided to create a game to have people learn about how to prevent HIV. Okay, this game has been downloaded by 50 million people in India and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, it's been translated in many different languages. They've adapted to the local cultures. Okay, so that's clearly something which is directly relevant for adults. Okay, and of course for young ones as well. But I mean, this is really interesting. Okay, and there is another experiment that comes from India, where they put some computers in the walls in the village or in the slums, and they made it accessible for the kids to learn. And that also has already been imported in Africa because it's fantastic the amount that can be learned once you have access to knowledge, and then you learn by yourself, having access to knowledge. In fact, it's not complete by yourself, it's by yourselves, in the sense that it's community of children that are learning together, okay? And they're also learning about how to share information, how to share the knowledge of building knowledge together, which is an essential skill. Then another example from India, Indian farmer, maybe you know the Khan Academy. Okay, the Khan Academy is a website to learn mathematics that is a very interesting innovation coming from the US. Okay, even more interesting is this innovation coming from India because it's not one guy, Khan, giving knowledge to the others. It's Indian farmers telling about the knowledge they've acquired about the best practice locally, and then making it available to all of the fellow villagers anywhere, anytime. Okay, and so the same thing can be applied to any society. Okay, you just need a web interface and an access with a cell phone for these sorts of things.
I like that sort of learning in the community type thing. I think that's sort of community action as opposed to having something imposed on a community. They're actually doing it themselves. And the Khan Academy is very much sort of old wine in new bottles. It's just old teaching via technology. It's just nonsense. I'd like. Okay, if it can be brief, because I want to just make sure that we give our audience and delegates a chance to come.
This case, which for me was very shocking, very interesting, very inspiring. I found in Botswana, I work a lot in Africa, I met in Botswana a group of people called the Basarwas. I don't know whether you have heard about them. They reject school. They don't want to send their children to school. And of course, from a government perspective and from people who are keen on having children in school, this is an absurd. I mean, the government wants to put schools there, and they don't want it. I went there. It was a 2-day journey. I wanted to ask them, why don't you want to send your children to school? Are you crazy or what are you? Are you wise or what? They're wise. They don't want this to send their children to school because the Basarwas are characterized as a cultural group that never punishes children. Dialogue is the main way of communicating with their children. They know from others, or they have seen, that this is not the school that they know. So why send their children to school? And I think these people may be unschooled, but they're wise.
And they're probably not rioting. And they're probably not rioting. Sorry, that was a London joke for those that weren't in on that one. I'd like to now open this out to you. You've been very patient and watching our little dinner party in the front here, which I need you to be involved now. Before I open it broadly, I'm going to be a little bit elitist here. Is there anybody from the Learner's Voice group here that would like to ask a question? No? I'm asking only just because you don't have to, it's not obligatory, but yes, please, the lady just down here.
MIT, part of the Learner's Voice program. So touching on your last point, I guess when we talk about education and specifically education for all, given that education's purpose, I guess, is cultural and societal advancement maybe, and given that different people have different cultural roles in different societies, is there one standard set of things people need to know? Or, I mean, is there something that, everyone should pass through? Is there a certain type of schooling that everyone needs to pass through, like certain standards, like we say?
That's a really good question, actually. What about accreditation for lifelong learning? How is it accredited? How do you, is it badging? How does it work?
I'm happy to speak to that one. I think it's really important that we're focusing a lot more strongly on how we learn, and that what we're accrediting is the ways that people engage and took control of learning and were able to represent their learning. The what, it becomes then the next point, and the what can change throughout your whole life and in lots of different contexts. Then how do we accredit that? I think that's why we don't emphasise it well, because it is hard to assess and to evaluate and to accredit. But because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. I think the other thing with that is that if we're looking at the how, it means in certain contexts, how is related to context, absolutely. So in some situations you might be expert, and in some situations that same person is novice. So how do we talk about the skills that you bring to both of those situations to engage and to be able to make decisions and have a way to move forward in your life and the things that you want to do? So I think we need to have much better ways of understanding that. We've tried through many different ways to look at employability skills and those sorts of things to describe it. I just think we're just really rubbish at it, and that's been the real problem around accreditation.
Francois?
Reading, writing, and counting as part of these basic skills. I think that you have to be able to read what others have been producing. Okay, but that means reading, for instance, the signs of an animal in the forest. That can be very relevant. Okay, it could be, reading a TV interview of a politician and decoding all the wrong things that he's trying to sell you. Okay, and when you talk about writing, okay, we are not only talking about writing letters. We are talking about being able to produce content with any sort of technology. Okay, and it could be painting. It's expressing yourself, and it's conveying something to someone else. Okay, and it could be done by all sorts of technology that are as ancient or as modern as you want them to be. Okay, and counting means having a scientific approach to the world. Okay, and a scientific approach to the world is something very general, especially in a digital age, because now you have everything is numbers today. Okay, so you have to be able to live in a world where everything is in numbers. So you have to understand what those numbers mean, how they are being built, and why are they relevant to you.
Thank you. The gentleman at the front, please. We're going to have a microphone down, and then we're going to take the gentleman behind after this one.
Good morning. They are Brown, panelists, and they are public. Okay. I have got a lot of key points from your speaker. Okay, I am Heiser Ledesma from Colombia. Okay, I have taken a lot of key points from your exposition, but I have chosen 3 key points. When you, Mrs. Wallace, talk about the lifelong learning, and when you talk about the African experience, and you talk about your Mr. Tadei, talk about the learning process. Okay, I want to say a short story from my own experience. Yes, too short. While working at the Universidad Sergio Arboleda in Colombia, working on the satellite, I learned that it's important, math, science, technology, but in some cases we forget the meaning of the process of learning. I mean, I was able to solve problems in that project about the sensor does not work with what we need to do. The time of the satellite is not correct. What's happening? But when I was in my house, it's crazy, but when I was in my house, my mother say me or ask me, hey sir, please, I need to adjust my spoon, for example, a tool for in the kitchen. I was confused, and I didn't know what to do. What's happening? But I know maths. The question is that maybe I had an organized knowledge for do anything, but not organized to do another things. The question is that knowledge is to solve something, yes? So what do you suggest? We had a lot of tools, scientific calculators, computers, USB memories. As much as memories we have, we memorize at least less things. So what do you suggest? How to organize that all technologies and things and tools to solve real problems, not satellites and other things.
Okay, before
Thank
we
you
answer
so
that
much.
question, can we just take the question from the gentleman at the back, and then we'll answer them both, and then we'll have to close. Sorry about that. Thank you for the question. I think it's great that Colombia has a space program when the UK doesn't.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the panelists. My name is Kevin Lamb. I'm with Keystone Global Education, and maybe we should change the name to Keystone Learning instead. The question I have is for Francois, and it is in the last 5 to 10 years, we've learned so much about the brain and how the brain works, and we can now stick a kid in an MRI and watch him solve a calculus problem. Has that learning and those new insights about how the brain actually functions, where is that playing into how we're thinking about the learning process, and especially in lifelong learning?
Thank you. So we have a question about tools and organizing information from the gentleman at the front, and from the gentleman at the back we have a question about neuroscience. What are we learning from neuroscience in terms of lifelong learning, how it's occurring and how it's being affected? Who wants to go first? Now, we have to keep the answers very short because I'm getting hassle from the front.
Okay, let me start with the neuroscience. I'm a fan of neuroscience. I think it's bringing wonderful knowledge and insights into what we do as educators and as learners. I'm developing a concept which is a pro-age learning. Let's do, at every age has limits and potentials. This is what neuroscience is telling us. We have to do away with the idea that adults are learn it harder, it takes longer. It's not that simple. There are many things that you learn better when you're an adult that you cannot learn or learn in a more difficult way when you're a child. So every age has important potential. I think from neuroscience we can derive today lots of important knowledge in order to make a case for lifelong learning. The problem is, again, how do we make this knowledge available to everyone, to teachers, to educators, formal, non-formal. It's not there. It's not in the training of the teachers. It's not even sometimes in the mindsets of the policymakers and the technocrats who take the decisions. The second point I would like to make is one thing that has struck me in this conference. There's lots of talk about innovation and creativity. Two buzzwords. I never heard in any panel say what I'm going to say here. The poor are the most innovative people in the world. The poor are the most creative people in the world, because you cannot overcome the problems of poverty and survive unless you are creative and highly innovative. They are born problem solvers. So what are we doing with that potential? It's there, and we simply ignore it. And in conferences like this, in many others, we think innovation is something that is in the future, and it's in the mindsets of some highly, extremely qualified people. Why don't we go out and see the innovation, creativity that is already there? And why don't we change our school systems so that the poor can develop those capacities instead of inhibiting them, which is what we usually do in the school system?
Good point, Ronsoir.
So I love what you just said, and I'll come back to it. To come back to go to your neuroscience question, one of the interesting developments is they've been trying to understand why can we read and why can we count? Because those were not selected before. So they were looking the parts of our brains that are lighting up during that process. And by being able to follow the whole process happening in the brain, they've developed games that allow kids to learn to read or to count better. Okay, so that's one already interesting point. There's another point that I think is very relevant for lifelong learning, which is that they found out that one of the things that has to be used is inhibition zone in your brain, right here, okay? Because you should not use necessarily the first solution that comes to your mind. You have to inhibit that first intuitive solution, and sometimes you have to think deeper. Okay, and that's a very important skill. So very often you have to unlearn. Okay, so you have to be able to activate this part. Okay, so that's one point. To come to the technology, and we'll go instantly to the poor. To come to the technology, and you have to, and making things relevant. Okay, there is a big movement throughout the world that is called DIY, do it yourself. Okay, which I prefer to call do it ourselves. Okay, personally, because it's a community. Okay, that is inventing things and putting them on the web and sharing whatever they've just invented. And they are making everything open source, not only software, but also hardware and wetware and all sorts of means of organizing things. And so everyone can contribute to these things, and they can solve whatever local problem they have at their hands. Okay, and those technology, the price gets done every year. Okay, so the same way you have, all of you have cell phone. I mean, it's even cheaper to build your own robot today. Okay, and then the robot is going to solve a problem that is your problem. Okay, and you can decide. Okay, and today you can already print 3D objects that are, the piece that you need to, repair your machine or do something that is relevant for you, okay? And those things, again, are getting cheaper and cheaper exponentially, okay? So tomorrow we'll have the means, not only the information, but also the infrastructure to be able to produce the technology that is locally relevant. And that's, to come back to the creativity question about the poor. Clearly they are the most creative, but they are not empowered by technology yet. Okay, and they are not able to share on a global scale their innovations. Okay, but if you allow them to connect, okay, that's why technology, why science works. It's not because there is a single genius somewhere. It's because there is a network, a community of people working together. So if you allow these poor people to connect to these technology communities, then they will be inventing amazing technology, solving the problems that they face in their daily life.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up the panel now. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to come and listen and take part in this debate. And I'd like you to show your appreciation, please, for our fabulous panelists. Thank you very much.